Is corporate America trying to groom American children for servitude? You hear that all the time. People say that. Is there really something of a plan to do that? Our next guest is going to talk about that with us because she has written about it. Lynn Paramore is somebody whose writing I always look forward to reading. She writes about the intersection of culture and economics, which is, of course, close to my own interest. If you know me at all, she's senior research analyst at the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and she has a recent piece out there at their website, ineteconomics.org, entitled "The Corporate Plan to Groom U.S. Kids for Servitude by Wiping Out Public Schools," and that pretty much says it all. So first of all, Lynn, thanks for coming back on the program.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
And secondly, great piece, and rather than me summarize your own writing, let's start with this. Let's start where you start. We're seeing a lot in the news about teachers and students. We had teachers go on strike in West Virginia and Oklahoma, talk about those strikes spreading elsewhere. The teachers are striking not only for pay, but for better education. But we've had what seems like a long-term war on education funding in this country, haven't we?
Yes, we have. And Gordon Lafer details what's been happening, I think, very well in his recent book, The 1% Solution. He began looking at various efforts that have been going on across the country on the part of conservative legislators, partnering with big businesses like Walmart, like Koch Industries, Amazon, Bank of America, to do things like smash unions and cut public services. And he found that they were really, since about 2011, targeting education very, very hard. And they were doing things like introducing legislation that would require lowering accreditation for teachers, increasing class sizes, insisting on more online education, directing funding to privately run charter schools away from public schools. And really, the overall effort seemed to be to really dismantle public education. And he asked the question, why would big business do that? You can sort of see why a company that made online education platforms might be out to make a short-term buck in those kinds of changes. But why would America's largest companies be so actively involved in efforts to promote, really, there's no other way to put it, education failure? Why would it be in their interest? So he sought to answer that question, and the answers he came up with, I must say, are pretty sobering and alarming.
So, and the answers were, I've speculated about this myself, but what were the answers that he found?
Well, there's the obvious thing, wealthy Americans have never particularly wanted to pay taxes. So that's a pretty obvious answer. But he found something even deeper. He saw that really big businesses and wealthy Americans are promoting policies that are going to increase inequality even beyond what it is today. And it's already as bad as it's been in 100 years in the United States. And that kind of economic inequality creates social unrest, which is a troubling phenomenon, even social uprisings. So in order to protect themselves, really from the public, from ordinary people challenging them and fighting back, he believes, Lafer believes, that lowering the expectations of the population and really America's children and grooming them for a life where they're no longer really going to expect upward mobility and to be, citizens with options and fulfilling job prospects, that really they're not going to be groomed for citizenship, but for servitude and, bad jobs in service industries, places like McDonald's, large retail chains like H&M. And if you put people in a framework where they're so insecure about their future and their present, they don't have enough money to cover life's challenges. They're really just trying to survive day to day. They don't have enough energy left over to mobilize against the people that are stacking the deck against them.
And they're also not willing to take the risks that might be involved if you go out and demonstrate, if you advocate for different policies or whatever. They might be afraid that their employers won't hire them. So many corporations now are contracting out work, and we have the ridiculously named sharing economy where people can't be guaranteed of income or benefits from one month to another. So all of that makes a sad amount of sense to me. In addition, if you think about the history of public education in this country, going back to the philosopher John Dewey and others, the notion that the original notion of public education was that we weren't just educating people so that they could read and write on behalf of their employers. We were educating people to be citizens. That was the philosophy behind public education in this country. But if you don't want them to be citizens, then of course you don't want public education. But let me ask you something, Lynn. So what's the mechanism? I can't picture them sitting around and sort of, rubbing their hands and saying, how do we make sure we train people for servitude? So does Lafer or anyone else that you know of get into the sort of mechanism of how these ideas get shared and disseminated and justified so that it becomes something they all put money into?
Yes, Lafer actually looked at a number of organizations. One that your viewers may be familiar with is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which combines conservative legislators with representatives from some of America's largest companies. And that group works to promote legislation aimed at privatizing that which has been in the public sphere, education being one of the strongest focuses of that group. Also, there's a Koch network funded by the Koch brothers, Koch Industries, that's also working to convince legislators to promote policies towards privatization, and again, focused on education. And these are highly coordinated efforts, Lafer found. I mean, if you look state by state since 2011, you see over and over that these policies have been pushed. In Florida, for example, now you can't graduate from a public high school without taking an online course. The idea being that eventually we'll have teachers with lower accreditation standards who are really just administering online courses and platforms for students. Maybe there will be no teachers at all eventually. And the teacher strikes that we have seen in West Virginia, in Oklahoma, Kentucky, they may be spreading to other places like Louisiana, I think is part of a pushback at this effort that's been going on for years, which is making lives miserable, not just for students, of course, but teachers as well. In West Virginia, things got really, really ugly. Not only were the teachers, I think they were ranked 48 out of 50 in terms of their pay and benefits. But that wasn't even enough to push them over the edge. What really pushed them over the edge was they were asked, or required really, to submit details of their health on a daily basis to a phone app, things like their waist circumference, their sleep habits, in order to access health care. So that was something that really took away their human dignity. And that's what really tipped them over the edge finally.
Well, that's interesting. That's right. I had read that, and I have investigated before some of these corporate wellness. I hadn't made the connection with using it on teachers as well. But it is such a dystopian vision, isn't it? And including the notion that we wouldn't have teachers as we know them now, but would just log on and interact with something that doesn't know us or doesn't know us the way we want to be known as human beings, as personalities, and so on. And it reminds me, and I'm sure you're familiar with, but it reminds me of people like the economist Tyler Cowen, who has written, and then Thomas Friedman has popularized a number of his ideas that average is over, and that if you're not exceptional, if you're maybe just of average ability in certain areas, you just will live a life of misery and exclusion in this country. I think Cowen says that 85% of people, the way things are going, are just going to be excluded, and the remaining 15% will be the elite. And of course, what he doesn't say is that within that elite, there'll be a 1% elite. Within that 1%, there'll be a 0.001, and so on. But it's really, in other words, and there's an ideology dimension to this too, that the private sector is better at everything and all that, and a hostility to government intervention. So where do we go with this then? If this is if the idea is to pacify people by depriving them of hope as inequality soars, how would you foresee the future playing out, and how can we fight the future?
Yeah, it's a really big question. One of the authors who's helped me understand, the depth of that question is Peter Temin, who is Professor Emeritus of Economics at MIT. He's also a grantee of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and he wrote a book last year, which I would recommend to everyone in addition to Lafer's book. His book is called The Vanishing Middle Class, and he describes a phenomenon whereby dual economies are created. This term dual economy comes from a West Indian economist named Arthur Lewis, who was looking at countries in the Caribbean, developing countries, in which there was a rural population which really served as a cheap source of labor for people in the cities. And it sort of broke down into, maybe about 20% of the population was affluent and doing well, and then the 80% was really living in very insecure, depressing circumstances. And he sees that model is now applying to the United States, to a first world country, which is a very scary trajectory. And once you have a dual economy, it's very, very difficult to get rid of it. And it often takes something like a war, a very bloody, painful situation for people to be able to dismantle that. Political mobilization, as we know, is very difficult. It's hard to get people with, from different groups to join together to fight these kinds of developments. But that's really where we're headed. And if you have a society in which people cannot move from the less affluent sector to the more affluent sector, then you end up with a country that looks more like Argentina or Russia. It's not going to look like the United States that many of us grew up in. And Peter Temin notes that in human history, dual economies are more common than unified economies. In the history of the United States, we've had dual economies at various stages. We've had the Gilded Age. We had the slavery system, which was an extreme form of dual economy. And it was only in the post-World War II period that we began to get a unified economy, and the idea that everyone should have opportunities and everyone should participate in the economy. That those ideas became widespread. But then there was a reaction to that, which we've been experiencing since the 1970s, which had to do with the discomfort that many Americans felt with racial desegregation and some of the advances in civil rights. And we've been seeing since the early 70s an increase in inequality and a movement towards this dual economy. And this is a dramatic statement, but you really may end up with something, to quote the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, where the lives of most people are poor, short, and brutish.
Right.
And
nasty.
Nasty.
Yeah.
Yes. Nasty, brutish, and short. Poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And, we've been there before, and we may be headed there again. And again, if we end up with an economy like that, it is awfully hard to roll it back.
Well, and in fact, we had the historian Walter Scheidel on. He wrote The Great Leveler, Violence in the History of Inequality. And in human history, we've already reached the level of inequality, according to Scheidel, where it has taken a major catastrophe to level things off again, whether it's a famine or mass disease or warfare. And we already have to hope we can find a peaceful means of addressing this. And so again, when I mention someone like Cowan or others who seem to say, well, it's just the way it is, we have to be sure that we don't allow it to become the way it is and not to accept the way things are now. So Lynn Paramore, we've got about a minute left. Any closing thoughts before we go?
Well, I think what you just said is one reason why we should all be very supportive of the teacher strikes and very excited about what they've been doing, because they are peacefully challenging these developments, and they've gotten concessions. For example, in West Virginia, they were able to wrest a 5% pay raise out of the state legislature and the governor, and they've there have been gains in Kentucky and Oklahoma as well. Now, on the part of the affluent, would you rather have that, or would you rather have something that's a lot more catastrophic? Because ordinary people can only be pushed so far, and there will be a tipping point, and we better hope that we can experience peaceful challenges like those the teachers have been doing before we reach that point.
Or as the cops in my hometown used to say, we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Lynn Paramore of I want to get your title right, Senior Research Analyst at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Great piece, and as always, great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the program.
It's great to talk to you. Thank you for having me.